Welcome, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us today, wherever you are around the country. Before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of our country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to also acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara people whose lands I live on here in Brisbane. And today presenting, we have Dr. Jim Radford. Jim was our head of science and conservation for many years, among many other roles while he was here at Bush Heritage. But Jim, around 5 years ago, left to join Trobe University, where he now is the Principal Research Fellow for the Centre of Future Landscapes. And I know Jim as our volunteer bird surveyor in Victoria. So we've got a really wonderful presentation today. So as per usual, we'll just keep everybody on mute. If you've got any questions throughout the presentation, there's a little chat box down the bottom of your screen. Just pop your questions in chat, and once Jim's presentation's finished, what we'll do is throw the floor open to anyone who'd like to ask questions, and also we'll hit Jim with all the questions in the chat box. But thank you, Jim, if you'd like to introduce yourself, and then we can share your screen and get into it.
Thank you very much, Michelle. If somebody could just give me a thumbs up that everybody can hear me okay. Cool. I'll just share my screen and go to slide view. Rightio. Well, thanks, Michelle. And it is great to be back at BHA in some capacity and talking to wonderful group of volunteers, which I'm now fortunate to count myself amongst. So today I'm going to talk to you about what might seem to be a slightly off-piste topic for Bush Heritage Australia, and about how accounting can help farmers to save nature through farm-scale and natural capital accounting. But I'm hopeful that by the end of the presentation, you will agree that it actually has quite a considerable important role to play. So before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from Dja Dja Wurrung country in central Victoria, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging there. So Bush Heritage, this is actually a really important topic for Bush Heritage as well, because Bush Heritage has been right at the forefront of environmental economic accounting, and particularly natural capital accounting for many years now, particularly the work they've been doing in Tasmania, in the Tasman Midlands, but also increasingly with the Land Restoration Fund in Queensland as well. And Bush Heritage, as you'll see down the bottom here, is a key partner and a really integral partner to this particular project as well. Right, so what do these companies have in common? They cover a range of sectors from food and entertainment through to fashion goods. Kering is the group brand of a number of high-end luxury products. General Mills produce a lot of our food. Well, they have all given a public commitment to sourcing their products sustainably. And many of you will have seen this ad from Coles, which I'll now play. I hope it works. Over the last month or so, and just listen to some of the key words that come through in this.
From the very beginning, when we dreamed, you helped us make it a reality. I ain't seen nothing like this before in my life. Our Coles farmer partnerships propel us forward.
Nice fluffy music, like beautiful landscapes.
No added hormones. Responsibly sourced seafood. And ever more responsible ways to grow. Our stores will be powered by renewable electricity by June 2025. Our dream is to be Australia's most sustainable supermarket, but we'll need your help to get there. Introducing Together to Zero. Zero hunger, zero waste, and zero emissions for generations to come.
Oh, anyway, I'll advance to the next slide now. So aside from the slightly questionable fish farms, the wind turbines that aren't going around, and no pictures of biodiversity or native habitat hardly, what does strike me, I can't get one next to, there we go, are these sorts of words that come through in this ad. most sustainable supermarket, renewable electricity, no added hormones, farmer partnerships, zero everything, but particularly zero emissions. So what is it that's driven a major corporate like Coles to suddenly recognise that they need to demonstrate transparently, or they need to explicitly demonstrate that they're being much more sustainable in where they're sourcing their products from? Clearly, this isn't something that's come upon them on their own accord. Otherwise, they would have done it 30, 40 years ago. This is being driven by consumer demand. They realise that there's a large sector of their market, an increasingly large sector, that is demanding these sorts of requirements in the food that they buy from Coles. And that essentially, for them to maintain their social licence to operate, they're going to have to demonstrate that they are doing these sorts of things, that they are moving towards zero emissions, zero waste, and a sustainable production systems. And so they will increasingly be putting demand on their producers, their suppliers, that they are producing their products in a sustainable way. Now, sustainable is a bit of a weasel word, as I'm sure many of you are aware. It doesn't have any quantifiable definitions around it. It doesn't have any thresholds. It's hard to certify and accredit. But in many ways, in this context, it at least has these components to it. And it probably has others that I haven't included here. But what we're interested in today are these notions that sustainable production has a place for biodiversity and nature, both in the production system at the farm scale, but also in the broader landscape. So it's not just the sum of the individual farms, it's the landscape in which they're embedded. And that as a consequence of that, or alongside that, there'll be a range of public benefit ecosystem services that are provided, not just amenity and recreation, but carbon drawdown, fresh air, clean water, and the like. Increasingly, notions around animal welfare and considerations of animal welfare in the production system are incorporated into these notions of sustainable production. And this responsible use of resources, responsible and equitable. So how a farm production system is using their natural capital and how that is distributed across the farming sector is becoming increasingly important, an important component into sustainable production. What we lack at the moment, and what is a significant gap, is a tool or a set of systems that enables us to quantify and demonstrate and report on this sustainable productions part of it, basically the essence of it. But what if there was such a tool? What if there was a system that enabled farmers to demonstrate in a repeatable, transparent, and reproducible way that explicitly quantified their use of natural capital in producing their goods? What if I could prove it to you? That would have a significant and transformative flow-on effect through the supply chain, right the way from the farmer to the retailer to the consumer. So this is where we think accounting comes into it. Now, as you all know, I'm an ecologist and an ornithologist at heart. So basically, up until about 2 years ago, I was only concerned with the right-hand side of this screen, things like little superb fairy wrens and the like. But through this project and my discussions with Integrated Futures, Sue Ogle from Integrated Futures, and many of the people at Bush Heritage, as amongst others, I'm becoming increasingly convinced that accounting that we usually associate with very dry and boring concepts such as we've got here is actually part of the answer to this, particularly in modified agricultural landscapes, but also in many of the more extensive and natural areas as well. So, taking a step back, what is natural capital and natural capital accounting? We use a very broad definition of natural capital in this project. It's essentially the stock of all renewable and non-renewable natural resources that underpin an agricultural system. So that's starting with the soil, water, air, plants, livestock, and native animals that, when managed and combined, they produce a flow of goods and services that are of benefit to people. Natural capital accounting, just like financial accounting, is simply a set of rules, a set of concepts and methods to quantify these resources, to measure, enumerate, and report on these resources. And in doing so, enables us to estimate the contribution that the natural capital makes to the production at a farm scale of their products, and more broadly, to, that's a bit strange, more broadly to economy and society. Recently, these systems have been endorsed and by the System of Environmental and Economic Accounting. So they're globally recognised framework in which we're working within. Now, we prepare the accounts in physical terms. I'll give some examples of that in a minute. We do it in physical terms because these are the levers that land managers can actually pull. They can manage the physical condition of the different types of assets, different types of natural capital on their property, to manage how they're using, how they're drawing down on their natural capital, or how they're rebuilding it. And so this is the management lever in which managers use their natural capital. But increasingly, where we can, we're also trying to define the natural capital in monetary terms to determine how fiscally how much it's contributing to the business. Now, in this project, we have very much an explicit farm scale or enterprise scale view of these natural capital accounts. So we are developing them for a particular enterprise. So to summarise, farm scale natural capital accounts that we're producing in our project are standardised, verifiable and repeatable methods to measure at a single point in time the stock of natural capital on that farm. And then if you repeat those measurements down the track, we can measure the change or the flow in natural capital. Now, we recognise there's many different elements to environmental performance and that they can't all be measured by the same metrics. So we have a bunch of them, and these different types of metrics measure different aspects of environmental performance, but where we can for the farm as a whole. So we can look at things like ecosystem integrity, soil condition, the greenhouse gas balance or carbon emission balance, the resource use efficiency in terms of how much nutrients and pollutants are being exported off the property, and where we can, the impacts on biodiversity, both positive and negative. And we think that these natural capital accounts will complement financial accounts to provide a broader view of farm performance by considering the impacts that the farming system has on natural capital and ecosystems and ecosystem function, but conversely, how natural capital contributes to the to the agricultural production and the financial performance of the farm business. So what do these accounts know? Got to go another step first. So this is a diagrammatic representation of a very varied farm that includes basically the different types of natural capital, which shows the different types of natural capital, the biological and ecological assets that you might expect to find on a farm. So we have, soil and water, both surface water and groundwater. We have the pastures and crops of ground covers, different types of native vegetation, or exotic vegetation, in fact, whether replanted as shelter belts or strips of vegetation, whether it's riparian veg or scattered trees in the paddocks or remnants of riparian vegetation. The livestock and the crops and the native animals, as well as the free assets and the foundational assets that come from nature, such as sunlight and rain. So this is a holistic view of a farm. In a traditional financial accounting view of that same farm, this is all that is currently enumerated and measured. So what's taken off the farm in terms of the biological assets for products, the livestock, any timber that might be harvested for trees or plant products for crops and horticultural products are recognised as an output. The property, the plant and equipment is recognised in the traditional financial accounts, and some measure of depreciation and land value is also assessed. But everything else that underpins the agricultural system, all of these ecological assets, the natural capital, is completely invisible in the way that we traditionally measure farm performance and profitability. These ecological assets, and the goal of natural capital accounting is to put these ecological assets on the books, firstly in physical terms and then eventually in monetary terms. So we know that these ecological assets are integral to the agricultural production system and that they generate a lot of the agricultural products and therefore the economic benefits. Many of them have private benefit goods. So mature trees provide shade and shelter for livestock, increasing production. And in fact, when they're in shelter belts for cropping systems, they reduce wind shear, reduce soil erosion, reduce evapotranspiration and increase production. Natural elements such as the grass covers and whether introduced exotic species or native species produce forage for livestock and food and silage. The soil and the soil biology produce composting functions, nutrient cycling, maintain water and facilitate water infiltration for crops and pastures. Shelter belts provide habitat for beneficial insects that provide pollination, pest control, waste decomposition services. And then there's a bunch of natural elements on a farm that provide public good benefits, such as habitat for native wildlife, such as trees that draw down and store carbon, both in the above ground vegetation and eventually in the soil. Riparian vegetation that protects waterways from erosion, soil leaching, provides a biofiltration function to reduce outflows of pollutants off the farm. And in many cases, there's joint benefit. These elements are providing benefits for the farmer and public benefit goods. We do know, though, through much of a mismanagement of agricultural landscapes in the past, that there's a deficit in many of these, and that's put a stress on the system, and in many cases, it's now dysfunctional. Now, in some cases, the government has stepped in and or other elements, in some cases, it might be an NGO like Bush Heritage in some areas, and said, okay, well, we'll pay a subsidy or an incentive to try and replenish some of these public good benefits back. So, systems, programs that have provided funding for fencing and revegetation of waterways have been around for a long time. We're seeing through the carbon farming initiative methods to incentives to increase carbon sequestration through planting vegetation and through better management of soils, and habitat management stewardship programs around conserving habitat or replanting habitat for biodiversity. So that's in elements of that joint benefit area. We also recognise that there is some disbenefits to the agricultural system that come through some of these parts of natural capital. So some, native vegetation or shelter belts can provide habitat, or some pest elements, be they pest invertebrates or rabbits or foxes, that actually are a disbenefit or a disservice for the farmer. We need to recognise those as well. So what natural capital accounting tries to do, and it's a very simple concept in many ways, is simply to measure and report on the extent and condition of the different types of natural capital on a farm and the contribution they make to the agricultural production, to the farmer and to the public good. And in doing so, we can sort of gauge whether we expect natural capital to, depending on the management practices in place, change either in terms of the type of natural capital. If you're shifting something, you might plant a shelter belt on some degraded pasture or something, so you actually change the type of natural capital, or the condition by slight changes in management over time. And how that is managed will affect the resource use, efficiency of the production system, and the types of externalities or bads that are generated from the farm in terms of outflows. So what does this actually mean in practical terms? How do we do it? Well, it starts with a mapping exercise, and we're doing most of this from using remote sensed imagery and some complicated machine learning and GIS applications. And thank God I've got some helpers to do this, because it's way beyond my brain capacity, to generate very fine scale, and in fact, we're much more fine scale than this now, maps of farms that in the first instance classify the farm in terms of the type of natural capital elements that are on a farm and the condition of those natural capital elements. And that's done from remote assessment of things like canopy cover, ground cover change, riparian vegetation, streams and soil types and things like that. There's then an on-site ground truthing and validation process that we're about to embark on in this project that says, well, how well did we do in these estimates from space, and how much do we need to tweak it? And from that, we compile a very detailed asset register, which is basically the intersection of the different types of natural capital on a farm and their management unit. So basically each paddock or sub-unit or sub-paddock will be a line in this extensive spreadsheet that details the type of natural capital, how big it is, its condition, what it's used for, what it was previously used for, and things like that. And from this asset register, we can roll these up to different degrees to generate the actual accounts. So the accounts themselves are basically a set of tables. So the first one, the most basic one, is this asset summary of the different ecosystem, or the summary of the different ecosystem assets that are on a farm. So this is all in aerial extent. So the numbers are hectares. So this hypothetical farm was measured first, or assessed first in 2015 and reassessed in 2020. These are the different ecosystem types that we might recognise on a farm. So there's some agroforestry, there's some native, relatively natural areas of grassy woodland or open forest. These may well be used for grazing in this instance. They can still maintain their ecological integrity. And the extent to which they maintain their ecological integrity is the condition state in which we place them. And so we use state and transition models as our basis for determining the ecological condition of these woodlands or grasslands or forests or shrublands or mallee, or whatever the appropriate state and transition model is for that particular property. Then there's areas that are more production orientated. So there might be some cleared areas that maintain native pasture or are exotic pasture. There might be cropped areas, there might be horticultural areas, there might be dry land or irrigated cropping, shelter belts, those sorts of things. And essentially, it's through that process of that I just described, you determine the aerial extent of these different ecosystem types and their condition in 2015, and then again in 2020, and we can enumerate any changes in these natural capital types over time as a result of management. So in this case, 39 hectares was converted from an exotic pasture to a agroforestry system, so that changes the natural capital type. So remember, this is not putting a value on this. This is just an assessment of the physical components of the farm. Some poor quality native naturalised pasture was converted to a shelter belt to improve shelter for stock and to improve potentially reduce wind shear for cropping, if that was the case. A change in management practices, which might have been, for example, a switch to a rotational grazing system. It might have been a slightly lighter stocking rate, or maintain the same stocking rate, but change your management system. It might have actually been addition of some inputs. Maybe there was, some soil testing showed that there was some nutrient deficiencies that were alleviated through inputs of nutrients or compost or whatever it might be. Improved the condition state of some of these cleared native pastures or riparian woodland or grassy woodlands here. The condition state was improved by destocking for a short period of time or destocking entirely. So changes in the condition over time are assessed and quantified. And that's essentially the basis of the accounts, so that they can look at how your natural capital is tracking over time. In addition, we produce things like this, which is basically a greenhouse gas emission balance for a particular year, but based on the previous 5 years' estimated average. So the emissions are generated from an assessment of the overall farm operations. What's their fossil fuel use, their fertiliser use, electricity use. So we do this through extensive consultation with the farmer and looking at their farm management accounts and their financial accounts. So it requires cooperation with the farmer. They need to open their books so we can see what they've spent and what they've bought, what their inputs into the farm are. We look at enteric emissions and other outputs from any livestock that might be on a property. This is using industry-based standards, adjusted for regions, in rainfall and pasture types, and any pre-farm production inputs, transport and the like. So to get an estimate of the total emissions in a given year of a farm, we then look at the sequestration and the carbon stocks on a farm above the ground and in the soil, and what the estimated sequestration rate is for a farm given their native vegetation cover and type. And this is again using Flint Pro modelling to come up with an estimated carbon balance. So these are actually real numbers from actually one of the farms that's in the Tas Midlands Conservation Fund property scheme. And when we ran the numbers, actually showed that this particular property was a net carbon sequester. So it was a carbon sink. It was a highly successful sheep grazing property that was actually sequestering more carbon that was emitting over a 5-year average, which came as quite a surprise to the farmer and many others. Won't always be the case. In some cases, obviously, the farms will be net emitters. But the key point is it's repeatable, it's explicit, and it's transparent. We can do similar things for resource use efficiency. That was a greenhouse gas focus, but we can look at water pollution or water usage, We can look at nitrogen use or lime usage or other resource inputs. We can look at how well the production was for water consumption modified for where it is in the landscape. So water stress measures. Several other measures like that. Now, in the current smart farming project that we're running, we have the opportunity to look in more in-depth and to add other layers that relate to on-farm biodiversity. So this is where the research comes into it. So we're trying to look at how those measures that we put into the accounts relate to more traditional measures, how we might view biodiversity, things that we care about from a biodiversity conservation perspective. For example, how much does it relate to the departure from a reference community for birds or plants or other groups? How is habitat maintenance on the farm? What's the area of wetlands or grasslands or woodlands that are maintained in a high condition state? And how does that change over time? How does the farm contribute to overall landscape connectivity? You know, are there corridors or key remnants that connect up larger parts of the landscape, both within the farm and as it moves out into the landscape? What's the diversity of natural ecosystems on the farm? Are there any threatened or rare or depleted or species of concern? So we're looking at how we can incorporate some of these more nuanced or more detailed measures of contribution to biodiversity into the accounts, which will reward those that do this well, and it will also make it explicit for farms that aren't doing this. And we have a second research stream that's looking at some of these ecosystem services. Now, we're focusing very much on agriculturally relevant ecosystem services, things like, is there a zone of pollination capacity or potential? Is there a zone of pest suppression related to the shelter belts or native vegetation or grass strips, or what's actually happening in the paddocks? You know, if you have a multi-species pasture crop, for example, do you have much better native pest control because you've got more natural enemies in that paddock? What's the local mesoclimate regulation that a shelter belt or a block of native vegetation will provide? And what we're trying to do is say, what is the dollar value? What's the additional value to production that these ecosystem services provide? So they're the obvious ones, but we're also trying to delve into things like nutrient cycling and waste decomposition and soil health. Soil erosion measures by maintaining seasonal ground cover. What's the avoided loss due to soil quality degradation? Avoided soil quality degradation. So again, trying to increase the depth of understanding of how natural capital contributes to the farm's production systems. So in summary, farm-scale natural capital accounting addresses a critical gap in agribusiness and farming by enabling farmers to measure and demonstrate their environmental credentials. We're building farm-scale natural capital accounts for 50 farms in southeastern Australia, from New South Wales, Victoria, and Tasmania. So we're using machine learning, remote sensing, and flexible on-farm data capture techniques, building that into our farm-scale natural capital accounting digital platform, so that when the time comes, we can enable rapid upscaling upon completion of this proof of concept project. So we think we've got the foundation of a project that could transform the Australian agricultural landscape by empowering farmers to demonstrate their environmental credentials, leverage market access and financial rewards. Investors, be they buyers, financiers, lenders, will be able to see the carbon, water, soil and biodiversity measures and choose their investments or their suppliers that demonstrate careful management of their natural capital for true sustainability, resilience and regeneration. The accounts have the potential to underpin, we think, agricultural markets. International markets, we know, are increasingly focused on ensuring carbon neutrality and environmental sustainability in green agricultural production. So the data and systems that we're generating could form the standard by which Australian farmers comply with domestic and international expectations for sustainability and resilience. We think that farm-scale natural capital accounting is a new way of measuring the environmental performance of farming and showing the sustainability through the supply chain of the agricultural products. It's a whole-of-farm system of environmental economic accounting that's enabled by this integrated digital platform to generate ecologically calibrated enterprise-scale natural capital accounts. So farmers will be able to demonstrate their environmental credentials and market this to their advantage. We hope this will reinforce positive and proactive management of natural capital, increasing environmental sustainability, climate resilience, and profitability by creating a virtuous cycle from paddock to market. Markets, on the other hand, or in turn, will be incentivised to reward farmers who are working with nature to produce the food we eat and the fibre that we wear in a sustainable way. It brings globally recognised measures of environmental performance to the farm gate. It empowers farmers to demonstrate their environmental sustainability credentials in ways that are relevant now and will become even more so in the future as trade tariffs and potentially trade barriers are placed in the way for those farmers and countries that aren't able to demonstrate their carbon and environmental impact as they're producing their products. So I will leave it there. Oh, I forgot to change that one. It also had some nice pictures on it. And open up for any questions and discussion.
Oh, Jim, that was amazing. Thank you. An absolute game changer. You gave some data there from Tasmania. Which other parts of the country have you been testing this?
Yeah, so we're working, so in the Midlands of Tassie, in sort of north central Victoria. So we're working with Birchip Cropping Group as our key partner in Victoria. So we've got 15 farms sort of between Bendigo, Horsham and Port, a bit of a triangle there. And in New South Wales, on the inland slopes, basically the grassy box woodland zone of the sheep wheat belt in New South Wales. So we've got a cluster of farms around Armidale and all through sort of central highlands, central west down to Wagga, Holbrook area, so quite close to Tuckcutter.
Yeah, fantastic. Now we've got quite a number of questions coming through on chat, so I will go to them first before we open the floor. So a message there from Barb down in Tasmania. Assume that nothing like this is occurring anywhere else in the world at the moment?
Well, no, I mean, there is a bit of a global movement towards this sort of thing. So there are other schemes out there that resonate or have similarities to this. So, you know, Accounting for Nature has a system that tries to similarly benchmark farms. There's the land to market operation, which uses sort of ecological outcomes verification, a more detailed or a very detailed measurement system. We think we are a little bit different and unique in that we're very much a whole of farm measurement. So all of the measurements relate to, to the entire enterprise and are holistic in the measures that we take and the way that it's reported. So yeah, it's trying to bring the best bits of everything into one package, I think.
Question here from Peter down in Victoria. He says, I'll try again. Natural capital, the benefits to people?
So that's a really interesting one. So I presume you're talking about well-being and mental health and things like that. So yeah, there is some research that suggests there's strong links there. It's not part of our project explicitly. We're trying to slip it in on the side a little bit and incorporate a bit of a well-being and mental health survey to our farmers as well. It's certainly an area that we're interested in exploring further in future projects as we build on this. And there is certainly, some research that suggests that farmers that farm with nature have lower levels of stress, have better mental health, have better resilience, if you like, personal resilience, because of knowledge of coping with drought and all sorts of things. So yeah, there is good links there, and it is an area of research that we'd like to much more explicitly link with our natural capital measures. That's a really good point.
Message here from Pam Lofthouse. What's the reaction of the Farmers Federation to this approach?
Yeah, great. We're getting so we have his name escapes me. Sorry, we have members of the Natural Farmers Federation on our advisory committee. They're very supportive. Warwick Ragg, who's sort of involved with the whatever it's called, the farm accreditation system. So yeah, they're very supportive of the approach. There is some hesitancy, I suppose, in that the potential of farmers using these accounts to broker individual deals with suppliers is sort of a little bit different to normal methods of by the way in which farmers have traditionally sold their products through wheat boards and aggregated marketing. So in many ways it enables those farmers that they think that are able to might be able to use their accounts to negotiate more individualized or customized contracts. I think that might be a little bit concerning, but in general there's strong support from not just the NFF but other peak bodies within the farming sector of this approach. So MLA is very interested. We're getting approached by the dairy industry, by the pork industry, saying, can you do this for us as well?
That's brilliant to know. There's quite a number of other messages here, so I'll keep moving forward. One from Kylie Durant. Jim, can you unpack the difference or not between natural capital and environmental condition accounts?
Yeah, not a lot. I think it's semantics mostly. The way I would see it is that a lot of the environmental economic accounts, environmental condition accounts that we've seen to date are top down. So they're very much taking to start with a regional view and looking at things like the extent of native vegetation in the landscape and how much has been depleted, or very large scale measures of environmental condition accounts, which is great, but it sort of loses relevance when you get down to an individual farm scale, because the resolution isn't that great. It doesn't help an individual farmer to identify what their contribution is, positively or negatively, to those higher scale accounts. So we're just trying to build our accounts from the bottom up, from the farmer scale up. Now, there's advantages and disadvantages in that. So theoretically, these farm scale accounts can be aggregated to provide a catchment scale or a regional scale. But that needs a lot of farmers to be doing them, and we don't have that yet. So there is those advantages, but essentially, no, it's Kylie, it's largely semantics. We could call these farm scale environmental condition accounts.
Thanks, Jim. Message here from Chris in New South Wales. Jim, do you have costings for the various processes required to produce the outcomes desired?
Yeah, we do, but they're not fair at the moment, because we're in this project, we're developing a lot of the processes as we go. So, for example, we've just spent basically 3 months with 3 people, almost full time, to generate the first cut of the ecosystem units, so that the farm scale mapping. Now, that's, as we go forward, that's not going to be a fair view of what that actually costs to generate it, because we hope that we'll automate these processes and it would be much quicker. So we would hope that there will always be an element that requires ground truthing, that requires expert input. Don't hold me to this, but ballpark, we would hope to think that a farm could do these accounts for about $5,000 in the future per farm, per estimate. Now, that's going to depend and vary on the size and complexity of the farm, and how well we can trust the remote data and those sorts of things. But we're sort of thinking, at the moment, it's much more than that, obviously, per farm, because we're building the systems as we go. But once things are automated and embedded and reliable, that will bring the cost down with everything.
Thank you. And one here from Norma in Melbourne. Hello, Norma.
Hi, Norma.
Jim, does this relate to regenerative farming, rotation of livestock, etc., rewilding efforts in UK reserving odd corners of properties?
Yeah, potentially can. So we've been careful and deliberately avoiding labelling farmers as regenerative or conventional or non-regenerative, whatever it is. We are looking at the practices that they undertake. Now, obviously, this has a lot of appeal to farmers that identify as organic or regenerative. And in many cases, their explicit goal is to improve the natural capital on their farm, particularly the soil capital, soil carbon and soil biology and things like that, through a whole range of practices. It might be, rotational grazing. It might be addition of multi-species pastures or multi-species cropping, addition of organic inputs and things like that fall into that regenerative farming basket. We're concerned less with what you do and more with the outcomes and the outcomes of that for the farm. So you could be a high input farmer, and there are examples of this, high input, high throughput farms that run their pastures and their crop areas really intensively, but set aside large areas for either agroforestry or revegetation or native remnant vegetation and generate other forms of natural capital that way. So it's simply a way of accounting for whatever those practices are on a farm and objectively and repeatably measuring what the outcomes of that is. So it's not saying it's not advocating for any particular farming practice in the first instance. I mean, ultimately it may get that way. Ultimately, it might be that there's a body of evidence that suggests if you manage in a particular way, you are building your natural capital and your soil capital. That's not the aim of our projects at the moment, but that data could be used in that sense.
One here from Alex Hams down in southern WA. It appears carbon is a major driver in the environmental accounting. Are there ways to incorporate biodiversity measurements in monetary terms?
Yeah, I mean, we are in terms of the ecosystem services that they provide for example, for pollination, pest suppression, waste decomposition. So we can monetize those aspects of it. We can't monetize at the moment the inherent biodiversity value. So what this group of people on this call would pay for a flock of swift parrots on their property is probably very different to maybe the national average. So we can't monetize those inherent biodiversity values, and I don't know that we necessarily should. But there are certainly aspects of biodiversity that we can put monetary values on for the services that they provide.
Might open the floor. Would anyone like to come off mute and ask Jim a question directly? Just pop yourself off mute and go for it.
Yeah, Jim, it's Crystal. Oh, sorry, I'm taped over. I'm just wondering, this is probably a very down the track question, but is there a likelihood that once the model is really robust, particularly in terms of metrics, would it be possible to help the farming community negotiate like tax relief for the kind of performance that they're doing in the ways that corporations might get relief for reducing emissions?
Yeah. So one of the repeated stated aims is for negotiating better terms with lenders and insurers. So you might get better, if you need to invest $500,000 into your farm and you're showing that you've got these accounts and you're showing you're trending in the right way and you're maintaining your natural capital. The theory is that you're a less of a risk to the bank, that you have greater resilience, particularly to drought and climate change, and therefore you are less of an exposed risk to the bank. And therefore you might be able to negotiate a better lending rate. Now, at the moment, that is just through ad hoc negotiations. There are examples where that has occurred, but it's just ad hoc negotiations by a farmer who's quite forward or has the support of a good negotiator to go and negotiate a better deal in terms of lending rates or a lower insurance premium, because they are a lower risk. Now, banks are increasingly recognising that where there is good natural capital, those farms are a lower risk. And that lower risk isn't in terms of ability to it is in terms of ability to repay loans. But what they're worried about is that if the farmer goes under, has to foreclose, and they end up with the property, they don't want something that's a liability on their books that in actual fact they can't sell for what they've got it insured for. So that financial sector is very much an area of interest and as a live area of negotiation and research, or not so much research, but negotiation to how it would work. Tax relief is another area, more so at rate level, so at local government level. I mean, I know the Bendigo Council, for example, is considering rate relief for landholders that have got recent plantings, revegetation plantings, and other aspects of sort of that would fall into natural capital accounting. And again, the accounts are just a way of measuring that in a repeatable way. So we would like it to be, okay, if you've got a set of accounts, it gets you over the threshold for eligibility for some of these things. And then it's up to the council or the bank or the insurer or whoever it is to look at your accounts and see whether they think you're eligible for a rate reduction or a lower tax rate, a lower lending rate or lower insurance premiums or whatever it might be. And yeah, ultimately, I mean, we work a lot. I mean, this project is funded through the Commonwealth Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment through this land care program, Smart Farming Grant. So they are very interested in, the Commonwealth government is interested in what's coming out of this, and ultimately it might be a tool by which they can offer some sort of tax relief to farmers. It's about to say something that was probably going to get me in trouble politically, so I won't.
Oh, thank you, Jim. Would anyone else like to ask Jim a question directly? We've got so many messages of thanks. Heather Campbell, our CEO, has just said, thanks, Jim. This has been a really great presentation. Has made a complex area easy to understand. I've just put in the chat my email address. The volunteers online and staff would know my email address if you'd like a recording. For anyone else, our supporters, you can just email me at michelle.stook@bushheritage.org.au if you'd like a copy of today.
There's a comment in the chat about flood mitigation, and that's a really, really great point. It's not something that's in our current project, mainly because most of the areas we're working in, it's not such a real concern, but I know that is, that's clearly a service that can be quantified and and incorporated into accounts where it needs to be. That's the thing. We're trying to make it flexible, that they're not all going to be the same, but it reflects the services that can be provided on any particular piece of land.
Hello, Michelle and Jim. Can you hear me?
We sure can.
Yep.
Two questions. The first is, I'm not a farmer, but I have farmer friends. How can they get involved in this process? And the second question is, do you have any specifics on vineyards?
Vineyards. Well, we've got it. Well, for our particular project, we've got our 50 farms. So we're at very much about to start the field program. Fingers crossed for COVID. But we hope to expand it. So if you wanted to pass this recording on and just get them to get in touch with me, I'll put them on the waiting list, so to speak. And the question around vineyards, again, we focused on broadacre in this project, but the concepts and the principles are just as applicable to intensive horticulture or vineyards, intensive animal husbandry, those sorts of things. So in many cases, the evidence for some of those ecosystem services I was talking about is a lot better in vineyards than anywhere else. And in fact, if you look at the research, the good examples of pest control are often in vineyards. So I think it's highly relevant.
Question here from Raymond. Thank you so much for that last question. So carbon says, oh, this is a tongue twister for me. Jim says, I'm not going to get it out. New plantings of trees and shrubs are obvious, but how is soil carbon increase measured and validated?
Yeah. That is going to be it's funny, if you do a search for soil carbon measures, you'll come across a whole bunch of companies that are promising that they can measure your soil carbon through a sensor in the field or through remote sensing or something like that. However, when you read there, if you can find any detailed methodology, you'll find that it's all still in development. Basically, the only way we can at the moment measure soil carbon is by taking a soil sample and taking it back to the lab. I think that will change, though. We will crack that nut, and soil carbon will be able to be measured in real time, either from remote sensed imagery. And there are some methods that are looking to calibrate and validate remote sensing through, with field testing. And I'm sure there will be, as remote sensing imagery gets better and better and more detailed, ways to do that. So at the moment, soil carbon is measured through field sampling. And the validation of that is through repeat field sampling over a long time. Now, we're not, in our project, we're not sampling to the specification or the robustness that's required for the carbon farming initiative. So to demonstrate you've increased your soil carbon through revegetation or changing your soil management in some way, that requires a specified and very intensive soil sampling program. And it is very much a really tricky aspect of it, and one that, when that can be unlocked, will really release a lot of the benefit in this. At the moment, there's still a lot of conjecture and conflicting research around how different practices influence soil carbon. It's just going to take more research, and I think the complexity of it and the site variability that's associated with it, we don't fully understand. And we're trying to make something really complex, really simple when we say, you know, practice X will improve soil carbon. So it is going to require, I think we're not really going to crack that until we do get either in-field carbon soil sensors that are able to measure that, or some way of measuring it from remotely. So it's a really good question, Raymond, but there's not a simple answer to it. And at the moment, soil carbon increases are measured and validated through intensive field sampling programs, which are expensive, they're slow, and they're quite complex. And that's why a lot of farmers have said, I can't be bothered with carbon farming initiative through government processes. I'm looking for other ways to get payment for my environmental improvements. So that might be through something like, you know, the Tasmanian the Midlands Conservation Fund, things like that.
It's Pat here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Pat.
Absolutely.
I'm just wondering if you had conditions where someone in the next farm created a potential big problem for you, like one farmer I interviewed near the Bendigo years ago, a forest was being cut down, or potentially, because they grew it for wood. And that would have affected the farmer that I was interviewing because of the flooding. Were you able to get an idea of that sort of effect on people, and, you know, do we stop it, or what do we do?
Look, we haven't had that situation yet, but, well, not like that, but, you know, we were talking to a farmer the other day, and you know, he pointed out that the farmer over, you know, the paddock next door was managed very, very differently, and there was noticeable differences in soil quality, but that's a slightly different project, slightly different situation. It's really tricky where there's agroforestry, where there's farm forestry that's grown, and the intention has always been to harvest that wood. I think that I don't really know how to answer that. I think it's almost a philosophical one. You can't, you know, if the intention has always been to plant a woodlot for farm forestry, then I think that they've got every right to remove that. Again, in the accounts, I suppose that would just be reflected in terms of the change in the type of natural capital and the flow that came from that. How it relates to the neighbour, which is your question, we haven't actually. I think Sue has got an accounting way of dealing with this, but I'm not familiar with it. There is an equivalency in financial accounting. I'm not sure if there's any accountants out there that can help me here, but there is an equivalency where something that's happening on the neighbour's property influences your potential, I suppose, or your capacity on your property. But I'm not exactly sure how that's handled. So I'm sorry, that's a really poor answer, Pat, to quite a complex question. So
sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. We've got a question here from Craig in Melbourne. Flood mitigation can provide a service down catchment. Do farm benefits like this get counted? Oh,
flood mitigation, yeah. So so that would be a situation where if your flood mitigation activities are providing a public ecosystem, a public good benefit, would be a situation where, basically you need to define it, you need to hopefully generate a market for that. It's the same as carbon sequestration. You're providing a public good service. At the moment, there isn't a market for that, but I do know that organisations like Trust for Nature and their marketplace for their Farmer Mutual project, for example, is looking to engage with catchments and councils to have payments for things like that, for flood mitigation services. So I mean, it's a public benefit that your farm is providing. There just needs to be the market to get paid for providing that public benefit service. So we have a couple of them at the moment, relatively immature, for carbon, for biodiversity, but I don't think there's a standardised one for flood mitigation, but that's where it would come into it. And again, the accounting would explicitly and repeatedly measure your contribution to that service. So if you've got, wetlands maintained on your property that reduce flood risk downstream, that is represented in the accounts.
Thank you, Jim. We've got about 5 minutes left. I've got to let Jim get back to work. So is there any final question there from the floor or the chat? No, thank you, Jim. That was amazing. We could have actually had you for about 3 hours, but I know you do have to get back to work this afternoon. And as mentioned before, if anyone would like a copy of today's presentation, please email me and I'll get that out to you in the hour. So it's just michelle.stook, STOOK @bushheritage.org.au. And thank you, Jim. It was awesome to see you again, and it was amazing. We really appreciate that.
My pleasure, Michelle, and thanks to everyone. Thanks for listening and for your interest.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thank
Cheers.
you.